Good morning.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
We'll just wait a little while for everybody to join us. Morning, everybody. Just bear with us for a couple of seconds while we leave everybody into this morning's meeting. If you could just make sure that your mics are switched off and your speakers are, so your cameras are switched off as well, that would be great. We are recording the session. Right, I think we'll start, shall we?
I think everyone's here, aren't they?
Good morning. My name is Les Jones, and I'm joined today by my colleague Rebecca.
Hi.
Rebecca Dunster is our clinical lead. Today is Stop the Pressure Day. So as we often say as part of these training sessions, pressure and posture are inextricably linked. So we thought we'd use that as the theme for today's session. Joining us today is Moira Evans from our sister company, Welland Medical. Moira will be leading the first part of the presentation. And then we'll come back a little bit more presentation on posture and pressure care. And we'll have a quick little overview of how we apply some of the theory to the seating products that we have with us today. A little bit of housekeeping. I think I've already said, if you're a little bit late joining us, if you could make sure that your camera is switched off and your speaker is switched off, we are recording the session. Also with us today is our colleague Jess. Jess is in the background monitoring chat. If you have any technical issues or any clinical issues as we move through, please post a question or the query onto the chat feature. If you have an issue with connectivity, it's a very technical solution that we recommend in the first instance. That's leave the meeting and rejoin the meeting. It quite often clears our kind of technical glitches. So without any further ado, I'll introduce you to Moira, and Moira will introduce herself to you. Moira's a tissue viability nurse and stoma care specialist. I guess that's right, Moira, yeah?
Yes.
So I will just pass you across to
Just to quickly
Moira.
mention as well, sorry Les, that if you are scribbling notes away, we're more than happy to share those presentations. So so Les, Jess will put the link in and you'll get a post-course follow-up email as well, and we'll be happy to share those presentations just in case you're worried about making notes.
Okay, over to you, Moira.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning to everybody, and thank you very much to CareFlex for giving me the opportunity to present to you this morning. My name is Moira Evans, and I'm the Clinical Marketing Manager over at Welland Medical, as Les said, our sister company, and I am a tissue viability and stoma care nurse. So it's lovely to be sharing the Stop the Pressure Day with you all. Our discussion really is going to focus upon how can we prevent pressure ulcer or injury formation. And just because those terms are interchangeable, pressure ulcer, pressure injury are the same thing. I'd like to use the 4 arms of the Stop the Pressure campaign, which are identifying the cause, complete a patient assessment, utilize clinical assessment tools, and ensure that pressure ulcer management is part of the holistic patient care. I'd just like to share a couple of statistics with you. The first one is that actually the NHS is estimated to spend £3.8 million every day in relation to pressure ulcer care. Also thinking that pressure ulcers are the most reported cause of harm in the NHS. And thirdly, up to 14% of hospital patients develop pressure ulcers. And that really explains why the focus on pressure ulcer prevention is so key, not only to the patients, the discomfort and pain, not only to the additional caseload for the NHS staff and others caring for patients, but also for the economic burden that this causes upon our health service. So if I follow the arms and look at identifying the cause, what is a pressure ulcer? You will notice that on all of my slides there are details of the article, the author, etc., because this is an evidence-based presentation. So I'm sure you're all aware, but the International Care Guidelines defines a pressure ulcer as a localized injury to the skin and or underlying tissue. Now, we know that most pressure ulcers will occur over a bony prominence because of the combination of pressure and shear. But it is worth thinking that most people who suffer with a pressure ulcer have comorbidities, whether it's mental or physical health. But the predominant factor is immobility. Now, this isn't just somebody who may be a lot older and have lost their mobility due to age or due to a stroke, but it may also be somebody that, for example, is put into, goes into theatre and they're on a theatre bed for a long time. So it's anybody who can't move for themselves. And we must also remember that we do have a new category, which is medical devices. So medical device related pressure ulcer. And that is anything that can be in contact with the skin that the patient perhaps is resting on, or that's resting on the patient's skin. So most common one is usually the oxygen masks, and you'll see that there's new foam on the outside of the masks now as it rests upon the face. But one thing that we are focusing on is prevention. And again, International Care Guidelines suggest that a risk assessment is undertaken, skin and tissue assessments undertaken, how we manage preventative skincare, repositioning, and the use of supporting services. I'm going to touch on all of those. The only one that I won't be touching on today is nutrition, but please don't ignore that one. So pressure then. Well, pressure is the amount of force acting on a unit of area. The easiest way I usually say to individuals when I'm presenting this lecture face-to-face is if you crossed your leg now and you could leave your top leg over the other one until the end of this presentation, take your leg away and press down, you will see that you have got pressure on your lower leg. And it's one way that we show people how to check for blanching hyperemia. But if we think about pressure, it's any surface that you're sat or lying upon. And the one thing is that we know that the weight of your body, for example, if you're in a chair, isn't necessarily going through all areas of that your skin that's in contact with that chair. It may be focused on the sacrum, it may be focused on the back of the knee, or even the back of the heel if it's in contact with something. So we just need to be mindful of where pressure can affect the body. Shear is the second type of problem when we're thinking about pressure ulcer management. And this is the other one. Now, I know you're all going to be sitting down somewhere, I hope you are, is if you just put your bottom to the back of your chair and slump forward, that's shear. And the concern that we have is when patients are sitting in chairs that perhaps aren't the right height, not perhaps the right width for them, and they fall down the chair. And the same can be said for the beds when they don't have a redistribution mattress underneath and they're just sliding. And what it is, it's the shear factor in this tissues below the skin. Because what it does is it literally stretches the tissue layers as that movement occurs, and that can be a problem that we may not see initially. The third factor, which is friction, and in some guidelines, friction is not included, but however, when we're moving patients, we need to make sure that they're lifted up and off the surface and not pulled along it, because friction is the superficial layer of the skin that gets damaged. And as we get older, our skin isn't as elastic as it used to be, and it doesn't allow things to move across it as easily as it used to. But the big concern for us in preventing pressure ulcers is managing pressure and shear. And it's really helpful for us when we think about surfaces that we ensure that we're not going to get friction from when we reposition patients on mattresses or cushions. But really the most important is thinking about mobility, whether we're moving the patient or the patient's moving themselves. And really it goes down to how we assess our patients. Now, you can see at the bottom, this element was taken from Moore, Stephen Haynes Callahan, and it's talking about moisture. And particularly when we're thinking about patients who may be incontinent, we really do need to manage the skin, because when we've got excess moisture on the skin, our elasticity and the performance of the skin normally is affected. And that means that the skin itself is more likely to be damaged by shear and friction. But one of the problems that we often have and certainly in my practice, is how do people differentiate between a moisture damage or a pressure damage? And that's why my colleagues and I, whilst I was at NHS Worcester, we collated the MOPT tool, and it's called MOPT because it's moisture or pressure tool. And this is something that if you're unsure whether it's a pressure ulcer or not, by using the signs and symptoms and looking at the cause, location, shape, depth, etc., the actual appearance of skin damage is different between a moisture associated skin injury and a pressure ulcer injury. And the idea for this is that if it's more, whichever ticks are on whichever side you have most ticks on, that's the most likely type of injury. And it was important for us at Worcester because we were getting a lot of calls for mattresses, etc., for patients with moisture damage and not pressure ulcer. But that's a really good article for you to read. And as Rebecca said, these presentations are available to you afterwards. But getting back now to patient assessment and risk assessment in particular, we're giving you a guidance today, but you do need to follow your own organisation or NHS Trust policy on how often should a risk assessment be undertaken, and also by whom. Where I worked, it was everybody's responsibility to look and support patient assessment. And pressure ulcer care really is multidisciplinary, touching across the physios, OT specialists, as well as ward nurses and long-term care nurses as well. If you're caring for a patient that is in your care and has been for a long time, there's usually a set period of time when you'd reassess your patient. May I stress that if the patient's condition changes, reassess then. Don't wait for a deadline to complete a standard reassessment. There are lots of different risk assessment tools around, and the predominant one in the UK is Waterloo, and that's so that everybody understands what the scoring means. But it's also important to undertake your own education to make sure that you're familiar with these scores and tools. And the big thing on my workload at the moment is skin of colour. And that's why normally tissue viability nurses today would be wearing red because the campaign started off as React to Red. However, I'm in black because I want to highlight that it's not about red skin anymore, because we can't see skin damage on patients with skin of colour because it doesn't appear red. But what I mentioned before about how to spot pressure when you cross your legs over is to do with a finger pressure test. And it's the easiest one that we can do, really. And it shows us whether the capillaries at the top level of the skin react to pressure and blood flow will stop. But when we remove the pressure or our fingertip pressure, the blood will recirculate. So we haven't got damage. And that's something that we do keep an eye on, really, as the non-blanching erythema is the first sign of damage. That means that the capillaries have been squashed and they won't recover. And that gives us a problem. So the other thing that really is very interesting to look at is explaining with nurses and other clinicians that it's not just what you see. We sometimes need to feel, because if a patient's got a skin of colour and it's a darker skin, then we won't see things. So we need to use our detection for heat and hardness, and they will also point you in the right direction. Skin hygiene we've mentioned in relation to moisture management. We really do need to make sure the patients have a clean skin if they are incontinent. And also, if they have got wounds, for example, on the back of heels, that there is an exudate sitting around the area, which will impact upon the skin's healthy status. You'll find that a lot of trusts will suggest barrier creams are used, which enables an additional support for the skin if the patient is incontinent. And they are really important because they can help reduce friction on any pads or anything else the patient's using, particularly if they're sitting a lot. Just to reinforce, really, patient assessment will be dependent upon where you work. It depends on geographic, it depends on whether you're in the NHS or in private sectors, but it's important, and I would imagine that everywhere has got a pressure ulcer or pressure injury classification system in place. So please go and find out what's local to you. I'd like to share a couple of assessment tools with you so that we can see other areas and what they use. Now, these are available off Google. And the first one is you'll see the pressure ulcer triggers, which is already out of date. That's really infuriating when you just put something together. And this is Hackney's assessment. And it's out of date because now the phrase is asking. So there should be an A before the double S there. And the A is for assessment. And the reason it's taken a new turn is because assessment is a key to prevention. So assessment, S is for surface. In my practice, we used to see a lot of patients on lovely, absolutely lovely beds and super duper redistribution mattresses, but the patients sat out for most of the day and they didn't have a redistribution cushion, or they were in an incorrect chair, or they were in a chair that didn't suit them at all. So thinking about the surface is really important. Second S is for the skin. Is there any difference? Are we noticing any injury there? K is for keep moving. The patient's got to be moved and this pressure's got to be relieved. I is for incontinence, and N is nutrition, which, as I mentioned, I won't be covering today. But this is the adaptation that I really do like, because it helps everybody. And this is the checklist from the Liverpool University Hospital. And it's actually taken from the Love Great Skin campaign, which I'll share with you in a moment. But this checklist really points everybody straight to where they need to look. And it's even color coded. So if you're ticking a box that's for yes, that's in red, that's a warning. And this is why it's so key. It's such a quick checklist to complete. And you'll see really there that the assessments are, what's the skin like? Do we have any redness or any erythema? Is there any non-blanching erythema? So that's when the skin doesn't recover after pressure. Does the patient complain of any pain or soreness? Because we can often ask them and they'll say, I've got a bit of a sore bottom, or my heels are hurting, and it's to do with the sensation. More worryingly is when they've got an injury there and they can't feel it. And that's because the injury is going down through the epidermis towards the dermis, and we've lost our function of our nerves. We also need to think of discoloration, and it does mention there about skin of colour. Is the skin broken or not? If you flip across, you can see devices are mentioned there: oxygen tubing, catheters. Now that could be for a circulatory, for an IV catheter in that respect, or it could be urinary catheters. But it does give you advice of what to do. So there are lots of different options around. And as again, I mentioned, have a look to see what's local to you. There is a new guidance that was issued last year at the Tissue Viability Conference, and it's all to do with skin tone bias in wound care. This is available for you to download from Wounds UK, so please do follow the link there and get your own copy. Because the big focus for us now is when we're managing and supporting patients to prevent pressure, it's how can we see? And that's got some really good recommendations in the guide. And this is also taken from Clark's article. And it's really key that we need to be able to see the differences, because for too long, we've all been relying on risk assessment models based upon Caucasian skin. So that was just a flag up for there. Try to always say what you see. And the reason I've put this here as say what you see is we need to be able to document it for each other. When other healthcare professionals come to care for that patient, we need to be able to alert them if there has been a change, if there's an injury, or if the patient's going through a recovery period. Perhaps they have got that new mattress. Perhaps they're now sitting in a more appropriate chair for them. But we need to alert each other. So by describing and defining, that's really key. And when physios and OTs go along to patients and do your thing, it's really important you let the nurses know what time that patient sat back down again, because that's when the clock starts. And it's really important that it is a team approach. If we think about saying what you see, and this is taken from the best practice statement, sometimes these marks and changes of colour can be quite subtle. And it's something that you may see, for example, if you're helping a patient get up out of bed, or putting appropriate socks and shoes on before movement. But sometimes it can be quite difficult to notice. And that's why I think the best practice statement is so important. And when you're looking at perhaps patients, sacrums aren't something you see that much, but it's really important just to be aware of what we are looking for, as we're almost detectives now. I did mention that there are some accessible resources. This is a great campaign and it's all free. You can download them. There's so many, in fact, if you look closely on that small slide, the third one in is where the Royal Liverpool have taken their checklist from. This is fully available to be shared and to be adapted, and is a really good tool. I'd like to share this one with you. When we're looking at clinical assessment tools, they've really got to be able to give the clinician a suggestion and insight. And for me, it's really important. I was a matron of a nursing home many, many years ago, and I used to measure my patients, and then they would have the appropriate chair for them. And I'm sure Rebecca and I will talk much more about that. But it's important because it's to do with resting posture and feet on the floor, all that sort of thing. So my suggestion would be to get hold of this it's a how-to guide, because not only to keep the patients moving, it's really helpful to share these things with the patient's family members, or if they're in a care home, to take along to healthcare assistants and get everybody involved, because it's everybody can help the patient to keep moving. And that leads me to holistic patient care and repositioning. I can't say how important this is enough. As nurses, we used to use a 30-degree tilt, which is pillows, moving patients forward. The physios on the call will go, oh, we do a bit more than that now. But it was something that we were able to look at. And the most important thing for me in patient care from a holistic perspective is repositioning. How can we help the patient to redistribute their pressure from one part of the body to another? And this is really important, because when people have long-term conditions, we need to factor in their quality of life. We need to factor in how satisfied or comfortable they may be in one particular position. And also, does that position give them any pain? And we need to manage all of those so that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet to support our patient. And there's lots of different discussions at the moment about repositioning. And the discussion is how often. And there's nowhere that's giving a standard guidance as to how many hours should be between one position change and another. And for me, it would be down to how strong are we as a team to go back and turn that patient again with staffing levels as they are. The second is how are we able to manage that the patient's skin can tolerate 3 hours in one position, for example? Are there any signs of redness or any early warning signs? And even simple movements. Now, one thing we used to try and do and suggest when people are in appropriate seating positions is just move or lean forward. I bet while I've been talking, you've already started wriggling. And that's because you're feeling uncomfortable. And that's what we need to mimic for patients who can't move themselves. And it's really important, because if the pressure stays on a particular part of the body for too long, you end up with oxygen deprivation in the area. That's the capillaries that are blocked, and that then causes us big problems. Another thing we need to think about really when we're repositioning is what's comfortable for them. And things like getting ready to eat at lunch, or just tilt back from a chair that can recline, a slight tilt, that's often enough just to give a bit of relief from pressure on one particular point. But it's really something that's very important to try and reduce the risk of injury. The reason it's so important is because pressure ulcers and pressure injuries can be very painful, are very distressing to patients and their families, and unfortunately are life-threatening. I have seen patients' death certificates that have the cause of death is a pressure ulcer, and that's the problem, and we need to prevent it. And this is why a pressure injury is classified as harm by the NHS and needs to be reported. It depends what category of pressure ulcer damage, depends what level your organisation wants it reported at, but find out. We need to ensure that when we've done something, we let people know we've done something. So if you've seen a patient and you've moved position, please do write it down, just so that it's recorded in their nursing notes or physio notes, OT notes, And that's literally how deep you sit into and rest on the surface that you're sitting in. And the second one is envelopment, how it comes around and matches your shape and form. But the big thing that's important to take on board is the recommendation from the European Pressure Ulcer Advisory Panel is that a support surface should be part of the patient's care. And it's important that they feel comfortable in that situation that you've put them in, and not just because they're at risk of this level, we're going to give them that piece of equipment. It's not about that. It's about making sure that the patients feel comfortable, because the impact upon their quality of life is immense. So we need to think about not only can the patient move themselves, but also what's the cover of the actual product that they're sitting or lying upon, because this takes us back to friction and shear from the very beginning. And for me, it's important that the surface of that material helps the patient stay cool. We've talked about moisture, and we talked in relation to incontinence, but if you've got an inappropriate cover on a device, it can make the patient very sweaty. And if that's the case, they've got a moisture barrier against their skin. So it's important to make sure that whatever we sit our patients on, it fits them, it's comfortable, the surface is supported, but also the cover is of the right material. Now, Amy Mitchell wrote a checklist. I'm not going to go through all of this with you, but it's a really good tick list. And for me, it's also very important that we educate patients to get them moving themselves. Even a little wriggle, a move forward and a move back is enough, a move across to the side. But it's important that we think about how we can help others help the patient. And we do need to think about how long do we want to leave that patient in a particular position. And there's some advice out there. This is, again, a quick Google search. This is Kent's community health recommendation is, so for carers and other supporters of the patient, do check for signs of pressure every day. Keep the patient moving, keep the patient hydrated, and ensure that you do use pressure relieving equipment. There is nothing worse than a tissue viability nurse going to a patient's home to see their expensive cushion still in its wrapper and the patient not seated upon it. But I'd like to conclude now really to talk about that pressure ulcers can be prevented, although there are some patients that will have pressure ulcers that cannot be avoided, unavoidable pressure ulcers, often patients who have taken the turn for the worse very quickly. So we're not talking about every patient, but if the patient isn't critical, we should be able to look at how can we prevent that. We need to think about when the patient's sitting. Are they sitting for a long period of time? Are they in any discomfort? And are they stimulated to move? And how can we remind them to move? Because if they have a wriggle, we've just relieved their pressure, and that's really important. As I mentioned, there's debate at the moment, is it patients change every 2 to 3 hours, patient changed every 4 to 6 hours? The big discussion is whether we should stop disturbing patients overnight and let them sleep. But if you've got a patient whose skin reddens 2 hours whilst being in the same position, if we left them all night, how much skin damage and injury would we have? So that's down to organisation, whoever's the main care for that patient, follow their lead. But the turning team, and you are involved in the turning team, any intervention with a patient makes you a turning team member. So let the people who are caring for the patients know if you, when did you sit the patient back down? What sort of movement have you encouraged the patient to undertake? And have you noted any spots of damage or early warning signs? As this is evidence-based, I'm going to leave you with 3 reflective questions, and they are based around how repositioning, the frequency of repositioning, and your role in that turning team. So in order to make this really helpful to you, think back on your own clinical practice and what you do every day. And I'd like to just reinforce that it's been a real pleasure to present with you today for React to Red and Stop the Pressure Ulcers campaign. And also to say thank you very much to CareFlex for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Moira. I think we'd all agree that's a very informative session. We'll have hopefully if we have enough time, we'll have a little question and answer session towards the end. I'm just waiting now for Rebecca to load her presentation, and we'll look at posture and pressure care from a slightly different perspective, the physio perspective. Is that right, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, thank you, Moira. That was excellent. So what we're hoping to do is just run through a bit of theory to really apply some of that evidence base and guidelines to specialist seating, how specialist seating can support that pressure care, and then look at some of the seating solutions as well then that can really hopefully reduce the risk of somebody developing a pressure ulcer or injury. And I do apologise because we got a bit of a hardware problem. So usually you'd get to see my face on the screen with this presentation, but unfortunately you're just going to have to look at our lovely chairs until we get the camera issue sorted. Okay. Now, as we've already gathered, posture and pressure are inextricably linked. Our body posture, the way we position ourselves, has a direct influence on the pressure going through specific body sites. When we're sitting down, that pressure that Moira spoke about is exerted through the skin and onto the soft tissues. That pressure can result in poor blood flow to the area, and that's what then causes that direct damage to cells. Now, we can only withstand those high interface pressures for very short periods of time. And if we don't get that repositioning, that redistribution of pressure, if somebody's unable to change the position independently, that's what then leads to that risk of skin damage. Now, a bit of the evidence as well. I know Moira kind of went into the details of how actually it impacts on individuals. This is just a bit more information around that, especially when it comes to good sitting posture and the impact that that can have on individuals' well-being, because of course they're going to be painful and debilitating, and the impact of them has been shown to be significant on them, not only physically, but also psychologically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually as well. Pressure injuries in older persons are associated with a 5-fold increase in mortality, and they can actually result in longer lengths of stays in hospitals, which of course then has major impact on other health outcomes, not just their pressure injury risk. Now, specialist seating systems, in the simplest of terms, they aim to reduce that risk by distributing the user's body weight, so that pressure, evenly throughout the chair over the maximum surface area. And then different functions and accessories, which we'll cover a bit shortly, will have an impact on those forces that Moira mentioned, so the friction and shear. This opportunity to sit out can offer a much needed regular change of position to encourage that blood flow to the cells, to redistribute the pressure, and hopefully then reduce that risk of avoidable harm. Now, when it comes to specialist seating, we've broken it down into 5 key objectives. So, of course, we've got the optimum positioning, looking at their postural care, the equal weight distribution within the chair itself, the correct chair setup, and we'll run through that with Les a bit more practically shortly. And Les's favourite term with that is the devil is in the detail. That's right. Fourthly, we've got the appropriate use of those chair functions and accessories. There is such a thing as over-prescribing, and we'll go into that. And then, of course, repositioning. So some of the postural challenges that we can see that can make it difficult for us to manage people's pressure care. We might see individuals with limited postural control, so that ability to remain rigid and erect against gravity to get that good sitting balance and head control. We could be working with individuals with pelvic instability, so maybe gravity is taking control and they sliding down into that posterior pelvic tilt, and then that's when we get those forces, as Moira mentioned, with the friction and shear. Maybe they have altered strength or abnormal muscle tone, so they're getting pulled into leaning, or maybe they're getting pulled into these kyphotic, scoliotic postures. We could be working with individuals who have sadly already developed contractures and deformities, which then impact on that weight distribution within the chair. Maybe somebody who has a wind sweeping posture, for example, within the chair, with an associated pelvic rotation and obliquity, and suddenly we've got all their body weight maybe going through one ischial tuberosity. We could be working with individuals with sensory impairments, and again, not knowing that they're uncomfortable, not knowing that they need to change position, because they're just not getting that proprioceptive feedback or that sensory feedback to know that they need to change position. So then they sit it for prolonged periods of time and not getting that independent change of position. And then also fatigue as well. We don't have to have any damage to the body systems for fatigue to take control. When gravity takes hold, it tends to exaggerate asymmetries, and then we get that unequal loading as well on the soft tissues. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on some of these postural challenges. On our website, we have got specific booklets for different body segments. So if you wanted to read more around some of those terms I mentioned, like wind sweeping and scoliosis and contractures, then on the website, I'm sure Jess will put a link to our info centre that's got a lot of downloadable things on there. It gives you a bit more detail around postural challenges, how they develop, and things that we can do to manage them. Now, I guess the $1 million question is, what is good sitting posture? I've put the good there just because it's not a term that I tend to like, because when we're working with some individuals who might have complex presentations, what we really hoping for is an optimum sitting posture. So it's their best possible sitting position, which might not necessarily meet this criteria. This would be the gold standard. And again, there's references at the end if you wanted to look into some of Pope's work around postural care. But what we try to do is aim for this. And if we can't correct postures, then we still need to accommodate them. So we're looking for the body to be conformed to the supporting surface as symmetrically as possible. We want the body weight to be distributed as equally as possible over that maximum surface area. So really as much of the person's body in contact with the chair, filling in those gaps to make sure that we are distributing that pressure. We want the body segments to be balanced and stabilized, but still be able to adjust to change. So still be able to reach outside of their base of support for hobbies, for eating and drinking, for activities, but keep that stability at the pelvis. We want the body segments to be supported and aligned as much as possible. And again, I won't go into too much detail because I know the time is limited with you. But when we talk about the body segments, even in sitting, we have to target every single one. So Moira touched on it as well, getting the feet supported. 19% of our body weight goes through our feet in sitting. So if we don't support the feet, and I'm sure you've walked into settings where maybe a foot plate is being used as a lovely doorstop, where does that 19% of their body weight then go? We've suddenly got that extra pressure going through the pelvis and going through the sacrum. And if somebody then already has postural challenges, we could potentially have 94% of their body weight just going through one side of the pelvis. And then we're wondering why pressure ulcers are happening. So it's really key we support all those body segments. The upper limbs as well need to be free from their low bearing role. So you might work with individuals who lack that stability and they'll be clinging on to the arms of the chair or digging their elbows into the corners of the chair to remain stable and to feel safe. But if they do in that, then suddenly they lose the functional role of their upper limbs and they can't use them to reposition. And again, re-emphasising what Moira said, enabling people to be as independent as possible in their repositioning, in their shuffling within the chair to try and get that blood flow. So if their arms are clinging on, they're not functionally able to allow themselves to reposition. And the same with the feet as well. If their feet aren't supported, how do they reposition within the chair? And just as a real visual here, just to see the effects, and I mentioned about fatigue and how fatigue can impact on the body segments, tends to be asymmetrical. You get the head rolling, the body slumping, going into this exaggerated asymmetrical postures. And what we're aiming to achieve is, of course, a more upright, supported, aligned position, full contact with the chair, opening up the shoulder girdle for physiological function to enable breathing and safe eating and drinking. And then those body segments in midline, and of course the feet supported. So the second point we had, the second objective was weight distribution. And there are particular parts of the body, especially when we're doing our seating assessments, that we have responsibility to check to see whether they're, especially if somebody is known to sit for prolonged periods of time, if they are immobile or unwell, or if it's just the nature of their disability or their diagnoses, that they're unable to move independently. Then there are particular areas that we need to check as part of the assessment. And we can get a good idea of that as well from the assessment process when we get them out into supine lying to see what the limitations of their body posture is. And now I mentioned about the feet earlier, kind of giving it away and preempted myself, but research has shown that even in this gold standard sitting position, now if we switch everyone's cameras on, I don't think many people are going to be sitting in this gold standard sitting position. But if you were, and this was a natural position for you with a slight anterior tilt, the hips, knees and ankles all at 90 degrees, then even in those positions, we've still got 75% of our body weight going through our buttocks and thighs. I mentioned about 19% through the feet, 4% through the back, and then 2% through the arms. This is why it's really key. All those percentages can add up. So we still need to make sure that the arms, the back, the feet, and all these body segments are fully supported within the seating prescription. And this is just some pressure mapping just to really see the consequences of unequal weight distribution. And again, the reference list will show you that this was from a study that was done at the University of Salford. It's in the Journal of Tissue Viability. So if you wanted access to that to have a read, they independently tested some of the CareFlex chairs. But this really just shows, you'll see in that first image on the left there, those red areas, those high interface pressures of the ITs, the ischial tuberosities at the bottom of the pelvis. And with the right seating setup, what we're aiming to achieve is that image on the right, where there's more equal distribution and less of those high interface pressures. The third objective we mentioned was the chair setup. So that initial setup, really taking it back to the basics of seating prescription. And sometimes, I don't know if you'd agree, Les, but a step that can get overlooked or forgotten about. It's really important that we set up the chair for the individual user, because if it's not, then it can cause more harm than good. Those chair dimensions, and Moira again touched upon this, seat width, seat depth, it's got to be based on the individual user's measurements. The way that we set up the chair will influence their positioning, which of course then has an impact on the weight distribution, their postural care, and then of course the pressure injury risk. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I think visually it'd be good for you to see Les showing you things like seat depth and seat width on the chair. But essentially what we're trying to do is encourage that pelvic stability at the back of the chair to maintain the pelvis so that, because it dictates what happens above and below, it's a really important, it's a foundation and really important body segment that we have a positive impact on the rest of the body. So we've got to get it stabilized. And if we don't get something as basic as a seat depth right, then, for example, if it was too long for the individual, then they simply won't be able to bend their knees over the seat edge. So what they'll have to do to get their feet on the floor or onto the footrest is to pull themselves down into that sacral sit-in. And then suddenly we cause that shear and that friction just from the way that we've set up the chair. They could have no postural problems, no specific diagnoses, but something as basic as the seat depth being incorrect, we've created that pressure risk. And the same that if it was too shallow for the individual, the area over which that body weight is distributed is going to be reduced, and it's going to increase those pressure, that interface pressure, and those pressure on the bony prominences. And the same with the seat width. If we have the seat width correct, then it can reduce the tendency for somebody to lean or to lose that pelvic stability, especially somebody who already has pelvic instability. Sometimes if we just give them a few inches, what we can see is that pelvic rotation and that obliquity happening because we're not stabilizing, we're not giving that lateral feedback. These undesirable movements will then have this cascading effect on the rest of the body segments. And we could see this obliquity, rotation, and it becoming increasingly unstable. And of course, with the unequal loading on the tissues as well. And then this could then lead to the development of serious postural challenges like a scoliosis. And the whole point of postural care is to protect the body segments, to protect the body system, and to reduce the risk of these avoidable things from happening so we can support the posture. When we mentioned about setup as well, another key part of this is not just the chair, but also the environment. So the way that we position the chair within the person's home or wherever they reside will have an impact on what the body segments do. So a good example of this, I'm going to steal one of Les's anecdotes here, is it could be a gentleman in a nursing home potentially who has a new chair put in place. Posturally, it's supported really well. We can correct the posture, we can get good alignment. But then suddenly we still see in this rotation at the trunk and the head. And it's just happening over time, and we're getting the feedback from nursing staff, from the nursing home staff. But then when we actually look at the environment, the TV is positioned off to the side. So something as simple as the setup of the chair within the environment can cause that rotation as well, because his main hobby, watching the TV, and he's naturally going to rotate the head and the trunk towards that position. So think about the environment as well. It can have a real impact on how that chair is used within daily life. I won't go into much detail because, again, Moira covered this fantastically, but the main thing to think about with shear and friction forces with seating is actually the correct, appropriate use of the functions and accessories. Of course, things like tilt and space and back angle recline could be fundamental to their seated prescription, but if they're not used appropriately, then actually can be more damaging to their posture care and then ultimately their pressure injury risk. And as Les goes through some of these functions now, I'll talk over you, Les, and just and jump in, and jump in with some of the justifications for using these functions, but actually when we need to be mindful and when we might actually be contraindicated or we need to be precautionary about using them. And then the last objective, repositioning, and again, as Moira said, I can't re-emphasize this enough. Appropriate management, or of course, better still, prevention will ultimately improve quality of life. And the key intervention in all the research is this redistribution of pressure through regular repositioning, because it's believed to be one of the most effective methods. Of course, as part of that whole holistic care, but really important. And we can utilize specialist seating and the different functional accessories to achieve some of this, especially if sitting is a significant part of somebody's day. It's believed that the average adult sits for around 9.5 hours a day. So if we think about individuals who lack the mobility, who lack the independence to change position, actually the amount of time that they could be in a sitting position. So we need to get that support surface as supported as we would be then looking at their bed and their wheelchair and so on. This was the guidelines that Moira mentioned as well, and it specifically says in those guidelines that we need to consider the pressure care by addressing their body size. So thinking about the chair setup, the posture, the mobility and lifestyle, so how we utilise that seating solution. Okay, so I think it'd be good now to actually see some of that I've mentioned in action.
So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to very briefly run through the key features and movements and options on one of our chairs, focusing on pressure care. I'm going to use a chair called the Smart Seat Pro. It's going to be a very brief overview of how we work with the chair. If you need more detail, if you refer to the website, lots of how-to videos there to give you a little bit more detail on the chair. Yeah, and a lot of the postural challenges that I've mentioned as well, it might be new to you. So definitely have a look at those booklets. And there's lots of images and stuff as well, so you can see what wind sweeping would look like, what a scoliosis would look like. But specialist seating can be a real fundamental part, as we said, because it can be a significant part of somebody's day to try and target those pressure injury risks. So my objective when I'm working with a clinician is to try and get as much of my client's body in contact with the chair surface as possible, in a nice midline posture where possible, or accommodate somebody's posture to kind of prevent further decline. So the chair is loaded up with features to help me do that. A key feature you've heard, and I don't want to teach anybody to suck eggs, but it's tilt in space. Another way of repositioning somebody using gravity to help redistribute pressure.
And I don't want to show the difference there between tilt in space and back angle recline. So we've mentioned those two. That's important as well, because if we get the use of back angle recline wrong, it can encourage shear. Yeah. So that's your tilt in space. The back to seat angle remains constant. So that critical angle to sit in, the hips and knees aren't affected, so pelvic stability should remain supported. And that is back angle recline. See the difference? Yeah. So if we get that wrong, we push the pelvis into a posterior tilt, and there's a risk of encouraging shear. Yeah. So that's a very key thing to understand
how the chair works.
Especially if you're working with individuals who have an extensor tone, just by opening up that hip angle, we can see that tone shoot through the roof, and then they'll just go into that sacral sit-in, opening up the hip angle, and we lose that pelvic stability. We've actually, it's probably worth mentioning, we've actually got a full webinar dedicated to the safe use of some of these functions and accessories. So again, if you wanted the link to that, just to get in a bit more detail, how important it is to get these things right.
Yeah. Shall I bring the camera down a little bit? So that's better. So we mentioned foot support. You either get your feet well supported, the correct seat to floor height. If it's a static chair, like a high back chair, hospital chair, feet flat on the floor. The thing with a tilt and space chair is as we tilt, we raise and bring somebody's feet or legs off the support surface, off the floor. So we use a foot plate. The foot plate is adjustable. And that's there to accommodate different leg lengths. Rebecca mentioned ranges of movement. Quite often get called back into review the use of a chair where somebody's had reddening and starting to develop pressure damage, and often it's involved or it's associated with the incorrect use of the leg rest. So if I have a limited range of movement at the knee, and carers insist on bringing the leg rest up like so, this is where I do a little bit of gymnastics. You can see, yeah, the only way I can sit is to slump into a sacral sitting posture, and again, not good for posture or pressure care.
Yeah. So again, leg rest elevation, if somebody doesn't have that knee range of movement, then leg rest elevation should not be used.
We talked about setup, seat width can be adjusted. Chair. So again, we support that person in the midline, try to get that linear position with as much of the person in contact with the chair as possible. Just take the arm off. Just to show you the impact possibly of incorrect. If Rebecca wants to join me.
Yeah. Just because you need my short legs.
And the short, yeah, so just bear with me. So,
if the seat depth is too shallow, then suddenly we've got this amount of the thighs not being supported. So we're increasing then the pressure that's going through the other parts of the pelvis. And likewise, if the seat depth is too long, and I can't flex the knees over the end of the chair, I have to go just to get my feet supported. We naturally seek that proprioceptive feedback through our feet. I have to go into that sacral sit-in, so we're creating that shear and friction and going into that sacral sit-in, which then has an impact on the rest of the spine and potentially causing a kyphotic position as well, which in turn will have an impact on physiological function and pressure. So it's really important, and I think that's one thing that we always mention if somebody's having difficulties with positioning, or you're getting re-referrals to say, oh, they're not sitting well in this chair, and take it right back to the basics and look at that seat depth and seat width before having a look at some of the postural.
So coming back to this, the support surface and the makeup of the support surface, all our chairs come with a pressure care system. It's called water cell technology. I won't go into the detail of that. But as Moira's mentioned, the fabric is key. So this is a 4-way stretch breathable fabric, which helps wick away heat and helps to lessen the effects of moisture buildup as well. And wherever you see the grey fabric on this chair, that's the 4-way stretch breathable fabric.
Helps with that contouring. Sorry, Les. Helps with that contouring.
Yeah, it's basically what happens is we've a combination of the 4-way stretch, a memory foam, and water cells in the base of the chair. High pressure points become absorbed into the seat surface. The stretch allows that absorption to happen. Memory foam reacts to the body shape, contours the body shape, and the water cells just displace. So they soak up literally the high pressure point, and it rises and spreads the pressure over a greater area.
And we've got more information on the website, as Les said, if you want more information about the water cell. It's probably worth mentioning here, because Moira said about the need, maybe some people have specific third-party prescriptions that they need to integrate into specialist seating. And of course, we know it's not just putting a cushion on top of a cushion. We actually have to integrate it into the system. So CareFlex shares, we can actually have a dock-in cushion that the third-party cushion can sit into. So we still have the seat width, seat depth, and all the postural support of the CareFlex seating system, but then the integration of a third-party specific pressured redistributed cushion.
I'll just talk briefly about the back, and that'll give us some time for Q&A. We can adjust each section of the back in a similar way. So where I have somebody with a fixed posture, I need to take the support surface to that person. I can't bring that person back into the chair. The back allows me to bring the support surface to the client, to the service user, the person sitting in the chair. That's a very, very quick overview of how we try to our input, if you like, into pressure care with specialist seating. One other function I should mention as well, we talked about movement and repositioning. This is a manual chair. We talked about tilt and space. We can power these chairs as well, so we can, where the person has the cognitive awareness to reposition themselves within the chair, we can power the chair, so we can give them with a handset and we can encourage that person to change the angle at which they sit. We also have a feature called auto tilt, which is a regulated motion. On the handset, you press the button and the chair will cycle through its range of tilt in space over a given time period. It's very imperceptible, but quite effective. So again, repositioning and movement. And for those, that repositioning, if you know our hydro tilt chairs, people often ask why we've got the wooden knuckles on the arms of the chair. And that's just what that's for, is to encourage somebody to reposition, is to give somebody that focal point to reach and to shuffle and to move themselves around a little bit.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning because again, just reiterating what Moira said, is identifying risk, thinking about, of course, the physical factors that can impact on somebody's posture and pressure risk, but actually the cognitive side. Does somebody know that they're uncomfortable? Are they aware that they need to change position? Or does somebody lack that sensory feedback, so they actually don't know that they're in pain because they don't get that sensation in those areas? So we need to think about those individuals who might be at risk as well, and thinking about their programme and working as an MDT to see how actually we integrate a repositioning program by using bits of different equipment. One question we get asked a lot is obviously about moving from a chair to a bed during a day. I mean, and coming from learning disabilities, that's my specialty. That's what I specialise in straight away. It certainly is part of a 24-hour program. If somebody is at risk of posture and pressure, then sometimes that change position to the bed. And we've done a great webinar recently with Simple Stuff Works, looking at positioning in lying, but actually sometimes we need to get that change of position and change of equipment, as well as using the functions to get that change. And we need that 24-hour program that everyone's invested in, so that everyone's got that to follow. And as Moira said, that we start that clock so we know how long somebody is spending in those bits of equipment, especially if it's a new piece of equipment. We can't expect somebody to go into a new specialist seating and use it for 10 hours straight away. We need that gradual introduction. We need to increase their tolerance in that seating position through a monitoring and review, and making sure that we, as part of the care plan, make that as easy as possible to follow. Okay, shall we throw it open to Q&A? Questions? There's a lot of information to get through in an hour.
Yeah, there's a lot of resource on our website.
And Moira gives some fantastic links as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we will share the presentations with you after as well. So, Jess, do we have any burning issues, any questions, any common themes from anybody?
Yeah, so we have a question saying, if someone has a pressure sore at the sacrum, can they still sit?
We try to keep them off it, and from a tissue viability perspective is try not to put any more pressure on that area. And that's why we'll try it from a sitting position. I suppose they still could, as long as we can use angles. and get them off it, because some patients, we can't lie down for long periods of time. So they'd have to stay sitting. And also it's about, you can't put somebody in bed for the next 6 months because they've got a pressure ulcer. So that's just wrong. So what it means is, how do we adjust their environment? So yes, there's different opportunities and things that we can do. And perhaps if the patient, most people want to sit upright when they eat. So that might be the only chance that they actually get to sit on their bottom in an upright position, is to go back through all of these different angles that Les has just been showing and Rebecca's talked about. But no, to directly sit on their bottom with a pressure ulcer, we would try and minimise the length of time they're sat on that. But they can rock to one side and rock to another. But yeah, try not to sit them on it for too long.
Thanks, Moira. Another question came through from a professional saying, I work with older adults within acute mental health services. We have at times clients who are urine incontinent during the night, but return home with carers who only support during the day. This could mean a long time wearing a soiled incontinence pad. What are the guidelines and/or recommendations around this?
That's a really good question. The first, yeah, I was going to say, it's coming to me, this one. For me, the main thing is, if we've got patients who are left alone at night and we've got this problem, is whether, if it's a gentleman, it's a bit easier, sorry ladies, is whether we could use a sheath, a penile sheath, and then it would drain and attach itself, and urine would drain through the tube into a leg bag, night bag, so that we're actually keeping off the skin. The other thing really is a case of whether the how much mobility the patient has, whether we could use a specific type of incontinence wear. It's really very difficult because obviously we need to think about what sort of materials could absorb any urine. If it's fecal, that is completely different, and we'd probably look at whether we can amend that patient's case requirement so they get a visit with the not just twilights, the midnighters staff to go and support. But easily the quickest ones, if it's male, if it's urine, is get into a urinary sheath, as long as they will tolerate it and not pull it off. That's my heed for that, gentleman.
Thanks, Moira. I think this might be a question for you, Les. Someone has mentioned that they've got a patient in a care home who would need to self-fund. And someone also mentioned about how much our chairs, the starting price is. Would you be able to go into that a bit more?
We quite often deal with people who self-fund. It depends on the individual, on the level of need, the level of postural support that the person requires. Do they stand to walk? Are they fully hoisted? Do they have a sitting balance? It's a wide range. I mean, the chairs start at, don't quote me on this, about £1,400 to £1,500. Hydrotilt chairs about 2001, 2002, which is our most popular nursing home style of chair. But it does really depend on the individual. I mean, if somebody'd like to drop me a line a little bit later, I can give you a better idea of cost.
Thanks, Les. And I think it's also good to mention that we offer free seating assessments.
Yes.
That way we can find the right chair for the person, and also following that assessment, we'll be able to provide a no obligation quote for how much that chair would cost.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that information we'd have would be the start of the process, if you like. We'd kind of triage. Jess would take the telephone call more than likely, or Lauren. We'd ask a series of questions, and then we'd arrange for a visit. We'd come out and we'd try different chairs. Just
to say as well, times are difficult at the moment, so it is a lot more limited than they used to be a few years ago. But people who are self-funding, there are sometimes charity options as well. Whether that's part funding, there are different avenue streams that we can look at to see. Yeah, we can suggest funding streams as well.
Thanks, Les. Just having a look here. I think that is all of our questions. Someone did ask if we'll be at the OT show next week, and yes, we will be. And I think Becca and Les will both be there as well.
Yeah. Just to say, just one publication that we'd like to point you towards. If you'd like a copy of our pocket book of seating, the Clinician's Essential Guide to Specialist Seating, written by Rebecca. If you'd like to just post a little link on the chat feature, we can get one of these sent out to you. I'll come and see us next week at the OT show.
Yeah, we've got a talk on day 1 as well.
Yeah.
Towards at 2:30, theatre 3, I think, Jess. So again, if somebody wants to come and join, that's more about complex disability and go into a bit more detail on the postural side. But yeah, we'll be there at the OT show.
Brilliant. Sorry, one more just popped through. We have a question saying, do you have any evidence articles I can quote to use for my argument for funding auto tilt, I believe that says?
Yeah, I mean, Moira's got loads in her presentation that people can refer to and have a read through those, and there's the references at the end of our presentation as well. That obviously goes into detail about the need to reposition. That's probably the biggest argument there, is using auto tilt for somebody.
With the clinical justification.
Yeah, we've got clinical justification guides for each of the chairs as well. That goes into a bit more detail on the functions and accessories, why they might be indicated. So yeah. That might be a good start. If I don't know if that individual wants to just email us separately with a bit more detail, or wait and see if they've got wait to see it and see the presentations and see if that answers their questions, see if there's anything they can use on there, and then get in touch again if you need a bit more.
That's great. I think that's all of our questions for now. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Moira.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, again.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you, everybody.
If that's it, have a lovely rest of the day. And if you're coming to the OT show next week, please come and see us. If there's anything else you'd like to query with us, it's info@CareFlex. So if there's no other questions, we'll bring the presentation to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.